When you imagine medieval life, bread might not be the first thing that captures your attention. Yet, if you stepped into any town during those centuries, you would find that bread shaped almost every part of daily existence. It was not just food, it was a measure of survival, trust, and community stability. For many people, bread made up most of their daily calories. That meant the quality of that bread, the weight of it, the price of it, and even the way it was sold mattered more deeply than almost anything else they touched or used. Because of this, medieval towns created one of the most detailed and strictly enforced sets of rules found anywhere in their society. These rules were known as the assize of bread and ale. When you hear the word assize, you might imagine a courtroom, and you would not be entirely wrong. This system worked like a combination of a market regulation, a legal standard, and a public safety law. It dictated exactly how much a loaf of bread should weigh, depending on the price of grain. It also set rules for bakers, telling them how to prepare their loaves, how to mark them, how to sell them, and what would happen if they cheated their customers. At first glance, all of this seems oddly strict, but when you consider the stakes, the rules begin to make more sense. A dishonest baker could weaken an entire community. Imagine walking through a medieval marketplace early in the morning. The air is cool, and smoke from kitchen hearths mixes with the scent of damp earth. You hear the sounds of traders setting up their stalls, the shuffle of hooves, and the soft murmuring of early customers. Bread sellers would already be at work. Some offered fresh loaves baked in the communal village oven. Others brought bread from small private bakeries tucked behind crowded houses. You might even see the loaves marked with small symbols pressed into the dough, simple shapes or lines that identified the baker responsible for them. These marks mattered because if a loaf failed the standard, everyone in town would know exactly who made it. Bread was not simply a matter of taste. In difficult years when harvests failed, the wrong decision about pricing could mean hunger, unrest, or even death. For that reason, the authorities would measure grain prices with care and adjust bread standards to match them. A loaf was required to grow heavier or lighter according to the cost of wheat. This system ensured that customers received the proper value every time. It sounds dull perhaps, but the people of the time depended on it. Even small deviations could push a town toward disorder. You might wonder why the weight of the loaf was the part that changed rather than the price. Stability mattered. For people living at the edge of scarcity, sudden shifts in price could create fear. A loaf that grew slightly smaller, however, was easier to accept. Bread had to remain obtainable by even the poorest families. By adjusting size rather than cost, the authorities maintained a rhythm of predictability that offered a sense of security in a world where famine lurked around the corner. But the rules did more than protect the price. They aimed to prevent adulteration. Some bakers mixed their flour with cheaper ingredients like sand, dust from old sacks, or even ground beans. The intent was simple. By blending in other substances, they could produce loaves that appeared larger without using the proper amount of grain. In a time when many households depended on each crumb, such practices were dangerous. They weakened workers who needed energy for long labor hours. They threatened the health of the elderly. They caused mothers to worry whether they could feed their children. Bread tampering was no mere trick. It was a direct attack on the well-being of the community. To enforce these rules, towns appointed officials known as bread weighers or assize officers. Their work was slow and repetitive, hardly heroic, but vital. They inspected bakeries, checked scales, measured loaves, and even tasted bread to ensure it met the required standard. They kept records of grain prices, deliveries, and the output of each baker. If they discovered short weight or poor quality, they issued fines. In more severe cases, the punishment could be public and humiliating. A baker might be placed in the pillory or paraded with his faulty bread. Public shame discouraged others from attempting similar fraud. All of this might seem like an overreaction to something as simple as bread. Yet, when you understand how closely food supply was linked with social peace, it becomes clearer. Bread was the foundation on which steady life was built. If a baker betrayed his community by cheating them, he threatened the fragile balance that made survival possible. The rules were designed not only to maintain fairness, but to prevent panic. For people living in a time before long-distance transport or large-scale storage, even a few bad loaves could spark concern about shortages. The assize created a sense of order in an environment where uncertainty was a constant companion. You might find it interesting that these rules also shaped the social status of bakers. They lived under more scrutiny than many other trades. Unlike a carpenter who built houses over months, or a blacksmith who forged tools only occasionally, bakers interacted with the entire population every single day. Their work sat at the center of life. People relied on them too heavily to allow mistakes to go unnoticed. A baker who followed the rules gained trust, while one who broke them risked losing not only customers but also his reputation and standing within the town. If you walked behind a medieval bakery, you might see the rhythm of their labor. Workers stirred dough in large wooden troughs, kneading it with tired hands. Ovens built from clay and stone radiated heat. The air carried the scent of warm flour and smoke. These bakeries operated almost constantly, because bread had to be made fresh. People did not keep loaves for long. Storage methods were limited, and bread hardened quickly. This need for constant production also meant that bakers were vulnerable to fluctuations in grain supply. When storms damaged crops or cold summers reduced yields, the emotional pressure they faced increased. Their customers expected consistent bread. The authorities demanded compliance with the assize, and yet the ingredients depended entirely on the yearly harvest. You can imagine how difficult it must have been during years when grain prices soared. The authorities would require the bakers to reduce loaf size. That meant shaping smaller portions of dough day after day, knowing that hungry families would notice. Citizens might complain. Some might accuse the bakers of greed, even if the rules forced their hand. Tensions rose easily in such times. The assize, though strict, provided a shield. Bakers could point to the law and say they were only following its demands. In a sense, the rules protected both customers and bakers by creating a shared understanding of what was fair. There were other rules as well. Bakers were required to keep their equipment clean. They had to store grain in protected areas to prevent contamination. They were expected to sell their bread openly, rather than in back rooms or hidden corners. Some towns required bakers to knead dough in front of inspectors on request. Others insisted that ovens remain accessible for surprise checks. While these measures might feel invasive, they reflected the community's belief that the baker's craft was too important to leave unchecked. If you consider all of this, you begin to see how a single loaf of bread could represent layers of meaning. It was nourishment, stability, trust, and governance woven together. Even the simplest part of daily life held an entire structure of rules meant to hold the world together, and this is why the assize of bread and ale existed for so many centuries, quietly shaping society through the most ordinary of objects. As you reflect on this network of rules and the careful balance they created, you might wonder something simple yet important. How did ordinary people feel when these laws shifted? When prices rose, or when the size of their daily loaf changed ever so slightly, bringing uncertainty to an already fragile life? When you picture yourself walking through a medieval town, you might imagine the bustle of the central marketplace or the distant toll of a church bell marking the slow passage of time. But as you continue to explore the world shaped by bread and the rules that governed it, you begin to notice something quieter just beneath the surface. The assize was not merely a set of regulations recorded in dusty books or proclaimed by town officials. It shaped the very rhythm of daily life. In this section, you will step further inside that world, exploring how the rules of bread affected every layer of medieval society, from governing councils to the poorest laborers. To understand why the assize mattered so deeply, you must consider how fragile food supply systems were. Grain was the backbone of survival, yet, even in relatively stable regions, harvests fluctuated. A single year of unusually cold weather could shrink yields. A stretch of rain at the wrong time could rot wheat before it was harvested. When grain supplies dropped, bread became noticeably smaller, and fear spread through households that already lived close to hunger. The assize tried to soften the impact of this uncertainty. It created a system through which the town, not individual bakers, absorbed the responsibility for stabilizing the supply of food. The process began with grain markets. In most towns, these markets operated under close supervision. Grain had to be weighed carefully, sold in designated spaces, and stored in ways that protected it from moisture and vermin. Officials monitored the flow of grain, not simply to manage commerce, but to ensure that no individual or group cornered the market. Hoarding was considered a serious offense, because it threatened the well-being of the entire community. When grain prices rose, the authorities documented every shift with precision. These reports formed the backbone of the assize calculations, determining each adjustment in the standard bread weight. If you stood near one of these grain markets on a busy day, you might see farmers unloading sacks from carts, merchants inspecting kernels by letting them run through their fingers, and record keepers working slowly with wooden tallies or small parchment slips. The work was repetitive, but essential. A miscalculation could throw off the entire system. Officials needed to understand not only the current price of grain but also the expected supply for the coming year. They had to think months ahead, anticipating shortages, planning imports when possible, and preparing the town for whatever challenges the next season might bring. Once grain prices were established, the assize could be formally adjusted. This was often announced in public spaces, so that everyone understood the new standard. Sometimes a town crier would read the updated rules aloud near the market square. Other times the proclamation was posted on the door of the town hall or near the main church entrance, where notices were traditionally displayed. Even those who could not read would learn the news through neighbors, customers, or the bakers themselves. The rules shaped the daily habits of nearly everyone, so the information had to spread quickly. For bakers, an adjustment to the assize meant immediate changes. They needed to measure their dough with greater care, shaping loaves that matched the newly required weight. If the loaf was too light, the baker risked punishment. If it was too heavy, the baker lost precious grain. Either mistake carried consequences. Bakers developed a sense of precision born from necessity. Their hands learned the subtle feel of the proper weight, long before a scale confirmed it. But the assize influenced more than ingredients and loaf sizes. It shaped the social and economic life of each town. A baker often lived close to the center of the community. Families relied on these workers, visiting their shops almost every day. The relationship between customer and baker required a high degree of trust, especially in difficult years. When a baker followed the assize faithfully, customers viewed them not only as craftsmen, but as custodians of stability. For this reason, honesty in bread making had a larger moral dimension. A baker who cheated the assize was not just breaking a rule, they were undermining the fragile structure that kept the town steady. You might wonder how bakers balanced the demands of the assize with their own need for profit. Many worked from early in the night until long after sunrise, constantly managing fires, kneading dough, and baking loaves for a population that depended on them. Their ovens required substantial amounts of wood, which had its own cost and logistical challenges. Clean water had to be fetched daily, often from wells that were shared with neighbors. Every expense mattered. Yet, the baker could not simply raise prices. The assize did not allow it. Instead, bakers relied on careful planning, disciplined work, and a deep understanding of their craft to maintain a balance between survival and service. Some towns tried to protect bakers by regulating the cost of materials other than grain. In certain places, firewood sellers faced their own rules that limited price increases during harsh winters. If firewood rose too sharply, bakers could not afford to heat their ovens, and towns would face bread shortages. Even the small details of coal distribution, charcoal production, and timber gathering became connected to the assize. In this way, the rules governing bread reached far beyond the bakery itself and influenced a wide range of occupations. The assize also shaped social hierarchies. Wealthier households often had access to finer bread, made from well-sifted white flour, while ordinary laborers ate darker loaves, made with more bran. Though both kinds of bread fell under the rules of the assize, the differences in texture and quality reflected broader social distinctions. Yet, in times of scarcity, even wealthy families could feel the impact of changing grain prices. A noble household might still afford finer loaves, but they too were bound by the system that determined weight and value. The uniformity of the assize created a shared experience across the community, reminding everyone that survival depended on the same fragile supply of grain. As you continue imagining this world, you might picture a small baking room with thick stone walls, narrow windows, and the glow of an oven that never fully cooled. You might see the baker with flour on his sleeves, pressing his thumb into each loaf to create the mark that identified his work. The mark itself was a small but powerful symbol. It represented accountability. If an inspector weighed a loaf and found it wanting, the mark linked the loaf directly to its maker. Some towns kept detailed records of these marks, almost like signatures. A baker's reputation lived and died through them. That reputation shaped the baker's relationships with customers. When parents sent children to buy the morning bread, they trusted that the baker had followed the rules. When laborers returned from fields or workshops, they hoped the few coins they earned each day would still buy enough bread for the household. The assize created consistency, but the baker provided something more personal. The baker offered reliability that shaped household routines. In difficult years when bread grew smaller, the baker often heard the community's anxieties directly. People asked questions, expressed worries, or looked for reassurance that the harvest would improve. The bakery became a space for quiet communication, where the everyday concerns of survival were spoken aloud. The punishment for breaking the assize could be severe. Public shaming was particularly common. In some towns, a baker who violated the rules might be forced to stand in a public place with a loaf hung around their neck, drawing attention from passing townspeople. Others were placed in a pillory, a device that held the offender in place while the community observed their wrongdoing. These punishments were designed not to harm the baker physically, but to reinforce the moral weight of the rules. The community needed to see that honesty was protected and dishonesty was addressed openly. Despite the strict nature of these rules, most bakers followed them closely. They understood the consequences of failure, not only for themselves but for the town as a whole. Many bakers saw their work as a kind of service. They were part of the essential structure that held life together. If they faltered, the system faltered with them. And so, through careful labor and constant attention, they upheld the quiet contract that the assize represented. You might be surprised to learn that the assize also influenced broader political stability. A community that felt secure in its food supply was far less likely to fall into unrest. Rulers understood this. Town councils, mayors and magistrates took their oversight of the assize seriously. They knew that public confidence in daily bread was one of the strongest foundations for peace. For this reason, the enforcement of the assize was not a trivial matter. It was a central responsibility for local leaders. The more you examine these rules, the more you begin to see how something as simple as bread could shape an entire way of life. The system was not perfect. It struggled in times of severe famine or war. Yet, even in those moments, the framework of the assize offered a sense of order. It reminded people that they were part of a community that valued fairness and stability, even when scarcity threatened. At this point, you might begin to wonder how this structure held up when pushed to its limits. What happened when grain shipments failed entirely, or when famine forced the town to choose between strict rule enforcement and the desperate needs of its people? As you reach the final part of this story, you may find yourself thinking more deeply about the fragile structure the assize created. The rules were strict, but they were also practical. They served as a quiet assurance that even in a world touched by famine, disease, and political uncertainty, daily life would continue with some measure of order. Yet, the system was only as strong as the conditions beneath it. When harvests failed completely or disaster struck, the rules faced their greatest test. This section will take you into those moments of strain, where communities were forced to decide how tightly they could hold on to stability when hunger pressed against their doors. To imagine these pressures, you might picture a year when the rains came at the wrong time. Spring planting went well enough, but heavy storms arrived as wheat neared harvest. Wind flattened the stalks, and wet weather made the grain sprout before it could be cut. Farmers walked their fields and saw their hopes for survival vanish in the mud. Merchants spoke quietly among themselves, calculating how long their stored grain would last. Bakers looked at their dwindling supplies and wondered how they would meet the expectations of the assize when the next season arrived. In such years, the atmosphere of a town changed. Meetings at the town hall grew tense. Council members had to consider whether to call for outside grain shipments, a process that could be expensive and risky. Roads were not always safe, and transporting grain required long journeys through difficult terrain. A sudden storm could spoil a shipment before it reached the town, leaving the community even more vulnerable. And when neighboring regions suffered similar shortages, competition grew fierce. The assize, though designed to stabilize society, did not have the power to create grain where none existed. It could only shape how the remaining supply was distributed. For this reason, towns often adapted the rules in times of severe scarcity. Some reduced the required loaf weight further than usual, stretching the supply as best they could. Others limited the sale of fine white bread, directing bakers to produce more loaves made from darker, coarser flour, so that the available wheat would last longer. These adjustments required careful judgment. If the rules were loosened too much, trust in the assize weakened. If they remained too rigid, people could not feed themselves. During difficult years, bakers found themselves under intense pressure. Their ovens still burned, their dough still rose each night, but every loaf represented the narrowing path between hunger and order. People watched their bread closely. They noticed when it became smaller or coarser. They felt the decline of its quality as a sign that larger troubles were gathering. A baker could not hide these changes. Bread was visible, tangible, and daily. It became the clearest indicator of the town's collective health. In some places, when conditions worsened beyond what the assize could manage, towns established emergency granaries. These were guarded storehouses where grain was measured, rationed, and distributed with exceptional care. The granary keeper, a role that might appear dull from the outside, held enormous responsibility. A mistake in allocation could trigger unrest. Too much generosity early in the season could leave the community empty-handed before winter even began. Too much caution could stir resentment and anger among hungry families. If you stand in your imagination inside one of these granaries, you might see wooden beams darkened by age and dust floating slowly in the shafts of sunlight that slip through cracks in the walls. You might hear the soft scrape of grain being measured, and the quiet murmurs of people waiting in line with their small sacks, hoping to receive enough to feed their families. There would be no drama in these scenes, only the heavy stillness of necessity. In these extreme times, cooperation became essential. The community had to come together, not by choice, but by the simple reality that survival depended on shared resources. Bakers, more than most, stood at the center of this shared effort. They coordinated with officials, adjusted their methods, and sometimes volunteered to use less grain than their allotted amount. These decisions did not come easily. Bakers had families to feed as well, but many understood that they carried a responsibility that extended beyond their own households. Still, not every baker responded to hardship with integrity. Some took advantage of scarcity, disguising spoiled grain with stronger flavors, or increasing the proportion of fillers in their dough. When inspectors uncovered these actions, punishments grew harsher. The towns viewed such acts not just as violations of the assize, but as direct threats to their collective survival. A baker who betrayed the community in a year of scarcity seemed to violate something deeper than law. They threatened the unspoken trust that bound the town together. The consequences of famine did not affect all people equally. Wealthier households often had reserves of grain stored in attics or granaries. Their bread might grow smaller or rougher, but true hunger touched them less quickly. Poorer families, however, felt every shift in the weight and quality of bread. A loaf that once fed a household for a day might now last only half as long. Children who once ate until they felt full now ate until they felt only slightly less hungry. Bread became a symbol of the thin line separating life from desperation. Even in these circumstances, the assize served a purpose. It created a structured response to crisis, encouraging the community to hold on to fairness even when scarcity threatened to erode it. The rules helped the town avoid chaos by giving shape to the crisis. People knew what to expect, even if what they expected was smaller loaves or stricter inspections. Predictability, even in hardship, offered comfort. Eventually, when the worst years passed, and the harvests returned to normal, the assize regained its usual rhythm. Grain prices stabilized, loaves grew larger again, and the town resumed its familiar routines. People did not always celebrate these returns openly. Medieval life encouraged quiet endurance rather than open expression, but there would have been a shared sense of relief, a recognition that the danger had passed. Bakers returned to their regular work, officials resumed standard inspections, and families fell back into their ordinary patterns of buying and eating bread. Looking back across these cycles of scarcity and recovery, you begin to see why the rules of bread mattered so much. They were not simply about fairness, they were tools for preserving stability, order, and trust. They represented the community's commitment to care for itself, even when resources grew thin, and they reflected the idea that survival was not an individual task but a collective one. Bread bound people together, not just in sustenance but in responsibility. As you reflect on the quiet power of the assize, you might wonder about its legacy. The rules shaped medieval life for centuries, influencing how people understood fairness, governance, and daily survival. They formed the foundation for later systems of market regulation, public oversight, and civil responsibility. Though the world has changed dramatically since those times, the idea that societies must regulate essential goods for the well-being of all remains familiar. Bread, in medieval society, was far more than food. It was a measure of trust, a gauge of hardship, and a symbol of shared life. And so, as the story of the assize comes to a close, you might ask yourself a final question. In a world where survival depended so heavily on a simple loaf, how deeply did those rules shape the way communities viewed fairness, responsibility, and their ties to one another? As you step into the dim, stone-lined streets of a medieval town, you might imagine the world settling into silence as night draws closer. But during much of the medieval period, that silence was not simply a natural part of the evening. It was shaped by a rule so ordinary that it often passes unnoticed in the retelling of history. This was the nightly curfew, a regulation that required people to extinguish their fires, limit movement, and retreat indoors once the town bell announced the closing of the day. You may think of a curfew as a rigid or even oppressive rule, yet in the medieval world, It existed for practical reasons that influenced nearly every corner of daily life. To begin, consider the simple reality that most medieval towns were built of wood, thatched roofing, and tightly packed buildings lining narrow streets. Fire was always a threat. The smallest spark could consume entire neighborhoods. A cook fire left untended, an ember drifting from a hearth, or a candle forgotten near a curtain could lead to destruction. Without modern firefighting equipment, communities had only basic tools to control flames: a bucket chain formed by neighbors, a few simple hooks, and the force of human hands were all that stood between survival and catastrophe. Because of this constant danger, medieval leaders developed the curfew bell, a nightly signal reminding everyone to bank their hearths and close their shutters. To understand this rule more deeply, imagine standing in the central square as the day grows dim and the air cools. The sky shifts to a deep blue, and the familiar scent of wood smoke hangs low above the rooftops. When the bell rings, it echoes through the narrow lanes. People pause, lift their heads, and adjust their steps. Merchants begin closing their stalls, apprentices gather tools, and households prepare their final chores before withdrawing indoors. The bell is not treated as an urgent alarm, but as a quiet instruction, a reminder that night brings risks that daylight does not. The origins of this practice can be traced to regions across Europe. Some communities used the curfew to reinforce public safety, and others used it to maintain order. In many places, the curfew helped regulate the use of open flames. It required residents to cover their hearth fires with ashes, so that only a faint glow remained. In households without chimneys, smoke drifted upward through small openings in the roof or seeped through gaps in the walls. These homes could easily catch fire if the flame was not carefully controlled. By insisting that fires be damped at night, town officials reduced the chances of a disastrous blaze. Beyond fire safety, the curfew helped shape social behavior. Medieval towns lacked the bright lights and secure streets that modern communities rely on. After sunset, travel became difficult and sometimes dangerous. Cobblestone or dirt paths, uneven wooden walkways, and unlit corners made movement slow and uncertain. Anyone walking after dark risked injury from a misstep or collision. For this reason, most people preferred to remain at home. The curfew simply formalized a habit that already made sense in daily life. But darkness also created opportunities for theft and violence. With limited visibility, it was easier for criminals to move unnoticed. Merchants feared having their goods stolen, and households worried about intruders. A curfew gave authorities a reason to question anyone found in the streets after hours. Those who had legitimate reasons for being out at night, such as watchmen or night workers, were often given tokens or written permissions that allowed them to pass without trouble. This created a clear boundary between ordinary evening life and suspicious activity. The curfew also encouraged communities to organize nighttime watch systems. These watchmen patrolled the streets with lanterns, staffs, and sometimes horns to signal danger. Their task was to maintain peace, guard against fires, and oversee the quiet of the town. When streets were mostly empty after the bell rang, the watch could focus on genuine risks rather than sorting through crowds of people. The curfew did not eliminate crime entirely, but it narrowed the hours during which trouble was most likely to occur. To imagine the experience more closely, picture yourself standing at the doorway of a modest medieval home as the curfew bell fades into the distance. Inside, the hearth glows softly, covered with a thin layer of ash to keep the fire safe. The room grows darker except for the faint light of a small lamp. You hear little from outside except the occasional footsteps of the night watch or the bark of a distant dog. The town, once full of noise and activity, settles into a stillness that is shaped as much by rule as by natural rhythm. In this quiet, families prepare for rest. Children settle onto rough wool blankets, and the soft crackle of the banked fire becomes one of the last sounds of the day. The curfew influenced the structure of daily routines. People knew they needed to finish their work before the bell rang. Bakers rose before dawn because they could not work through the night. Tavern keepers adjusted their business hours to match the expected closing of the streets. Craftsmen planned their tasks around available daylight. Even religious practices adapted to curfew restrictions, with evening prayers or gatherings held earlier in the day during seasons when sunset arrived sooner. The rule also helped regulate noise and unrest. While each town enforced the curfew differently, the underlying intention was to maintain a peaceful night. Without the distractions of street gatherings or late-hour celebrations, the community could rest properly. This was especially important in towns where long days of labor demanded reliable sleep. The curfew, while seemingly simple, contributed to the health and productivity of the population by aligning human activity more closely with available light and safety conditions. In some places, the curfew reflected political authority. Lords, mayors, or councils took responsibility for determining when the bell would ring, and this decision represented their role in safeguarding the well-being of the people. The enforcement of the curfew demonstrated the power of local governance and the expectation that residents respected that authority. A curfew was both a practical safety measure and a sign of organized civic life. Not all communities applied the curfew with equal strictness. Rural villages, for example, often relied on their own customs rather than formal regulations. But even there, the logic of the curfew made sense. Farms and cottages surrounded by fields or forests remained vulnerable to fire and nighttime hazards. Without the need for a bell or official decree, families often practiced their own version of covering the hearth and retiring early. The shared understanding of nighttime risks transcended local differences. Despite its importance, the curfew could become a point of tension during years of hardship or unrest. In times of plague, famine, or economic strain, people sometimes resisted restrictions, especially when evening work or travel felt necessary for their survival. Authorities responded with caution, balancing the need for order with the realities of daily life. Even so, the curfew usually endured because it served a fundamental purpose. It protected the community from dangers that could not be managed in any other way. The more closely you examine the curfew, the more it reveals itself as a rule built on quiet logic rather than force. It did not require constant enforcement to be effective. Instead, it relied on shared experience. People understood why the rule existed because they had seen the consequences of unregulated nightfall. Entire neighborhoods had been lost to fire. Goods had vanished under cover of darkness. Injuries from unseen obstacles or hidden pits had changed the course of lives. The curfew was not a burden but a guardrail, a simple boundary that helped keep danger at a manageable distance. As you reflect on these patterns, you might begin to imagine how the curfew shaped the feel of medieval nights. The darker hours were not filled with frantic activity, but with a slow, measured stillness. Homes became quiet islands of warmth, and streets became the domain of a few trusted figures. This regular, predictable pattern helped create a sense of communal safety that lasted for centuries. Yet the curfew also raises a question. How did communities adjust when extraordinary events required people to break from this dependable nightly rule? What happened when watchmen patrolled not simply for safety, but for looming threats? Or when fires, storms, or political tensions forced the town to remain awake long after the bell had rung? When you step deeper into the world of medieval beekeeping, you begin to notice that the rules surrounding the keeping of bees were not merely quaint remnants of rural life. Instead, they were carefully shaped by economic forces, agricultural rhythms, and a profound respect for the delicate balance between people and the natural world. In Section 1, you learned how beekeeping became a significant rural craft, one that shaped fields, households, and entire local economies. Now, in this second section, you will walk further into the unspoken logic that defined these laws, discovering how medieval communities built an orderly world around creatures that could never truly be controlled. It helps to picture a 13th century village during early spring. Most fields are still bare or muddy, waiting for the first ploughing, but bee colonies are already stirring. Villagers understood that the bees reacted long before the soil did, and local regulations often began with the idea that what happened in the life of a hive dictated what the human community ought to do next. One of the most important customs involved the marking and registration of colonies. A person who wished to claim ownership of a swarm had to follow the bees, sometimes across meadows or hedges, until they settled in a tree or crevice. Only when the swarm was traced and declared aloud before witnesses could the finder legally call it their own. This was an unusual form of ownership, one that was neither tied to land nor to crafted goods, but instead to an act of tracking and observing. These rules were not arbitrary. A settled swarm was valuable, but it was also vulnerable. If a family depended on the wax and honey produced by their hives, the sudden loss of a colony represented more than personal inconvenience. It could mean the loss of candles needed for the long winter evenings, or a diminished supply of honey that served as both food and medicine. Because of this, communities made sure disputes were decided quickly, often with elders or reeves stepping in before tempers rose. It was understood that the bees themselves would not wait for arguments to resolve. They would build, forage, and swarm on their own cycle, one that respected no boundary marker. Throughout Europe, the rules surrounding bees varied between regions, yet many of them followed a shared logic of fairness and protection. In some areas, if a swarm settled on a neighbor's land, the legal owner retained the right to retrieve it so long as no damage was done. In other places, the landowner could claim a portion of the honey harvested from that swarm, offering compensation for allowing the colony to remain. What emerges from these differing systems is a common desire to minimize conflict between households by acknowledging that the bees belonged to the entire landscape as much as they belonged to one keeper. Beekeeping laws also reflected religious and symbolic meanings. The church relied heavily on beeswax candles for its rituals, especially during the darker half of the year. Many monasteries maintained their own apiaries, and their knowledge of bees often influenced the broader region. Monastic beekeepers kept careful records, noting when swarms appeared, how colonies survived winter, and how weather patterns affected flowering plants. Their habits encouraged lay communities to adopt more formal measures, such as inspecting hives at specific times of the year, or prohibiting the cutting of certain trees that wild bees used for nesting. In this way, religious needs blended with agricultural practice, forming rules that were both spiritual and practical. You may wonder why so much attention was given to the behavior of bees, especially when other animals wandered freely. The difference lay in the bees' ability to produce materials that were rare and not easily replaced. Before the spread of sugar production and imported sweeteners, honey served as the primary source of sweetness in most regions. Wax, meanwhile, offered a clean and reliable means of creating light. A household with several healthy colonies could trade these resources, gaining grain during shortages or cloth during winter. This made bees a form of security, and any threat to that security was taken seriously. Because of this, there were rules about how many hives a person could keep. In towns where space was limited, beekeepers were required to position their hives so that the flight paths of the bees did not cross directly into neighboring yards. Some communities insisted that hives be placed at a certain height or distance from doors and windows. These requirements were not only meant to protect people from stings, they were also intended to prevent quarrels, since frightened animals or disrupted children could quickly spark arguments between households. By setting clear expectations, the laws helped maintain a sense of order. Another interesting detail was the obligation to inform neighbors when a swarm left its hive. This served multiple purposes. It allowed others to avoid the immediate path of the swarm, reducing the risk of panic. It also ensured that, should the swarm settle on someone else's land, there was no confusion about who had the right to claim it. The simple act of calling out, or sending word through a child or apprentice, carried legal weight. A person who witnessed the announcement could later testify in disputes, making the spoken word part of the community's system of record-keeping. These customs highlight how medieval life relied heavily on memory and trust. Without written contracts for every small matter, villagers depended on shared knowledge, repeated ritual, and verbal agreement. Beekeeping laws became effective only because people were accustomed to observing and recalling the actions of one another. The rhythm of the hive had to align with the rhythm of the village, and this created a natural incentive to follow established rules. You might almost imagine that the bees themselves served as mediators, encouraging steady habits through their steady work. At the same time, economic changes in later centuries began to reshape the landscape of beekeeping. As trade networks expanded, new sources of light and sweetness entered European markets. Sugar, once a luxury reserved for the wealthy, gradually became more available, although still expensive for many families. The church continued to prefer beeswax candles, but tallow candles made from animal fat became increasingly common in ordinary homes. These shifts did not eliminate the need for bees, but they did soften the absolute dependence that earlier generations had felt. Despite this, many of the old rules remained, partly out of tradition and partly out of a lingering belief that communities functioned best when the natural world was treated with respect. You might also consider the subtle social pressures that surrounded beekeeping. A neglected hive was not merely a sign of poor management, but could be seen as a failure of household discipline. Cleanliness mattered, especially during times when disease spread quickly through both people and animals. A healthy hive suggested stability, order, and attentiveness. Laws encouraging the inspection of hives or the proper storage of honey therefore served as reminders that personal habits influenced community well-being. Even the act of transporting honey or wax had guidelines. Some towns banned the moving of honeycomb during the hottest months, fearing that melting wax or dripping honey would attract insects or rodents. Others required that merchants selling honey declare its origin, so buyers could verify its quality. These practices ensured that resources remained trustworthy, and that no family felt cheated by poor or adulterated products. It is easy to overlook such details today, but they formed a crucial part of the everyday economy. As you examine the deeper patterns of these medieval rules, a broader truth becomes clear. Beekeeping laws were not separate from the fabric of daily life. They influenced farming, trade, religious practice, and even social harmony. A single hive could affect the timing of planting, the preparation of feasts, or the schedule of local markets. In this sense, bees served as a quiet but constant thread, binding the community together. Yet there remains an intriguing question beneath all of this quiet order. If these rules were built on shared customs and long-observed patterns, what happened when the bees themselves changed their behavior, or when new environmental pressures emerged that no rule could fully anticipate? Would the careful structure of medieval beekeeping remain steady, or would it be forced to evolve in ways that people of the time could not yet imagine? When you reach the final chapter of medieval beekeeping customs, you begin to see the full shape of a world that treated bees with a mix of reverence, practicality, and steady observation. The earlier sections explored how colonies were claimed, managed, and protected, and how communities built order around creatures that never recognized the concept of human property. Now, in this closing section, you will see how these quiet rules formed a lasting legacy, shaping not only medieval life, but also the foundations of later agricultural practice. To understand this, picture a late medieval village during high summer. The fields ripple with grain nearly ready for harvest, and the air is thick with the hum of insects. In this season, the bees work with relentless discipline, moving between flowering herbs, orchard trees, and meadow blooms. Their progress mirrors that of the villagers, who are also preparing for the coming months through subtle routines. One of the central customs involved assessing the strength of each hive, a task often performed by the head of a household, or, in wealthier homes, by a hired beekeeper with years of experience. This inspection was not only a matter of economics, but also one of responsibility. A weak hive could collapse in winter, leaving the family without wax and honey when they needed it most. The act of opening a hive, though simple by modern standards, required careful attention. The beekeeper listened to the tone of the colony, feeling for shifts in weight and movement. Medieval treatises, such as those copied in monastic scriptoria, offered practical advice. A healthy hive sounded steady and full, whereas an angry hive indicated disturbance or poor handling. These treatises circulated slowly, often over decades, yet they were cherished resources that shaped local knowledge. Some included simple drawings of wooden hives, instructions for building shelters to shield the colonies from damp winds, and notes on which herbs to plant near the hives to encourage better honey production. Such advice blended seamlessly with the legal customs that had grown around bees. By the late medieval period, many towns had updated their local codes to reflect growing trade. Honey and wax became important goods not only for domestic use, but also for sale at regional fairs. This meant that disputes over bees needed faster and more predictable resolutions. Toward this end, communities appointed officers responsible for inspecting hives, validating claims of ownership, and settling conflicts. These officers, often older men with long experience in rural work, served as quiet guardians of order. Their authority depended not on wealth or rank, but on knowledge and trust earned over many years. As trade widened, the methods for transporting honey also improved. Wax was shaped into blocks that could withstand long journeys, and honey was stored in carefully sealed earthenware containers. Laws emerged to ensure that merchants selling honey declared its type, such as meadow honey, woodland honey, or honey collected from orchards. These classifications mattered because the flavor and quality of the harvest differed depending on the flowers available to the bees. Consumers, whether townsfolk or church officials, wanted assurance that they were receiving the quality promised. This attention to detail helped preserve standards during a time when formal guild regulations were still developing. You may find it interesting that medieval communities often linked the success of their hives to moral conduct. In some regions, household misfortune was believed to unsettle the bees. Loud quarrels, neglected animals, or even unclean yards were said to disturb the delicate rhythm of the colony. While this belief had no scientific basis, it served an important social function. It encouraged households to maintain orderly habits, to settle disputes quickly, and to care for their surroundings. The bees in this sense became symbols of social harmony. Their well-being reflected the behavior of the community itself. Another enduring feature of medieval beekeeping was the tradition of informing the bees of significant events. When a marriage, birth, or death occurred in a household, someone would tap gently on the hive and speak a few words. This custom, known in some regions as telling the bees, expressed the belief that the colony needed to be included in the household's affairs, or risk becoming unsettled. While historians often classify this practice as folklore rather than law, it persisted widely and carried a quiet seriousness. People felt that acknowledging the bees helped preserve stability, a reflection of how deeply intertwined their lives were with the natural world. Despite these traditions, the late medieval period also brought challenges. Harsh winters, changes in climate, and the expansion of cultivated land altered the availability of forage for bees. In some areas, wildflower meadows were ploughed under to make room for grain fields. This reduced the diversity of nectar sources and placed new pressure on colonies. Communities responded by updating their rules once again, encouraging the planting of herbs, allowing certain fields to rest, or limiting the felling of trees used for nesting. Even small adjustments could make a difference in ensuring that the bees had what they needed. These responses reveal a broader truth about medieval life. People rarely saw the natural world as something they could conquer. Instead, they understood that survival depended on cooperation with forces beyond their control. Bees, with their intricate social structure and fragile dependence on seasonal rhythms, embodied this principle. The laws built around beekeeping were, at their core, attempts to create predictability in an unpredictable world. Through these rules, communities sought to align their own cycles with those of nature. By the dawn of the early modern period, many of these medieval customs still lingered. New innovations, such as improved hive designs, gradually appeared, but the underlying respect for the bees remained. Even as sugar plantations overseas began to change the economic landscape, beekeeping retained its importance in rural areas. Wax continued to be valued for church and domestic candles, and honey remained a trusted sweetener and remedy. The legal structures built over centuries did not vanish suddenly. They evolved slowly, reflecting the changing world while still carrying echoes of older habits. What remains most striking about this history is its steadiness. Many medieval laws were shaped by conflict or crisis, yet beekeeping regulations were built through observation and patience. They encouraged fairness, careful stewardship, and shared responsibility. They fostered cooperation between neighbors and offered a quiet lesson in how communities could align themselves with natural rhythms. Even today, modern beekeepers find wisdom in these older practices, recognizing that the principles of respect and attentiveness still apply. As you consider the full arc of these customs, a final question naturally arises. If bees played such a central role in shaping medieval communities, what broader lessons can be drawn from the way people structured their lives around them? And how might those lessons still speak to us in a world where natural rhythms are increasingly disrupted? When you imagine a medieval landscape, you may picture stone churches, timber cottages, or narrow market lanes. Yet one of the most important features of that world was something far more unassuming: the watermill. You encountered it on the edge of nearly every village, sitting beside a slow-moving stream or small river. Its steady wooden wheel turned day after day, grinding grain into flour at a pace no human or animal labor could match. But behind this calm and familiar sight lay a web of regulations so detailed that even modern property law seems simple by comparison. This first section explores the beginnings of those rules, examining why a structure as ordinary as a mill required such careful oversight. To start, imagine a village during early autumn. Harvest wagons creak along the rutted paths, carrying sacks of barley, rye, or wheat toward the mill. Every household depends on that building. Without it, the grain cannot be transformed into flour, and without flour, there can be no bread for the winter. This created a situation where the mill, its owner, and the water powering it were not merely part of the landscape, but essential components of survival. Because of this, the rights surrounding a mill stream had to be defined in precise and binding ways. In much of medieval Europe, mills were controlled by lords, monasteries, or chartered towns. These authorities often claimed what was known as ban rights, meaning local people were required to bring their grain to a specific mill and pay for grinding. While this may seem restrictive to you now, such regulations served important purposes. A single mill could be maintained efficiently, supplies of flour could be monitored, and authorities could make sure the machinery remained in working order. If every household built its own small grinding setup, the landscape would quickly become scarred by competing channels and unstable banks. For this reason, the water that powered the mill also fell under regulation. Medieval communities treated waterways as shared resources, yet mills required control over the flow to function properly. Even a small obstruction upstream could disrupt the wheel. A farmer clearing brush, a child tossing stones into the channel, or a neighbor watering livestock could cause the current to slow or shift. To prevent these disruptions, villagers established rules forbidding anyone from altering the stream without permission. These rules grew into elaborate codes that specified how high a weir could be, how often the channel needed to be cleared, and who was responsible for repairing banks after heavy rains. The machinery inside the mill added further complexity. Wooden gears, stone wheels, and troughs that directed water all needed continual care. Millers were expected to maintain this equipment, but they also had to follow rules guaranteeing fairness. One common regulation dealt with the toll, the portion of grain the miller kept as payment. The exact rate varied from region to region, but officials often inspected the mill to ensure that the measurements were honest and that no one was secretly taking extra grain. A miller caught using a weighted scoop or diverting flour for personal gain could face fines or lose the right to operate. These checks may seem tedious, but they protected the entire community from shortages and unfair practice. Despite these safeguards, the role of the miller was sometimes viewed with suspicion. This reputation had less to do with dishonesty than with the miller's unusual position in the community. Unlike most villagers, who depended on the rhythm of seasonal work, the miller's labor took place throughout the year. He worked beside the spinning wheel of water, often alone or with only a helper. The constant noise of grinding drowned out the familiar sounds of village life, creating a sense of separation. Because of this social distance, it became important to establish clear rules that defined the miller's duties, rights, and boundaries. One of the most important regulations concerned the division of water during dry seasons. When drought reduced the flow of the stream, the mill could not operate at full capacity, but other tasks, such as watering livestock or irrigating small gardens, still depended on the same water supply. Communities therefore developed schedules determining when the mill could divert water and when it had to release it back into the main channel. These schedules were often recorded in local court rolls or charters, and violations could result in severe penalties. This system ensured that no single user could claim more than their fair share of the resource. Such rules became even more complex in regions where multiple mills were built along the same stream. The timing of one wheel affected the next. If an upstream mill raised its weir too high, the downstream mill might receive too little water to function. Disputes over this issue were common, and local courts frequently had to intervene. Solutions were sometimes recorded in detailed agreements specifying the height of the weir in finger widths, or the number of wooden boards that could be added or removed according to the season. Each adjustment required cooperation, and the entire community had to trust that each miller followed the agreed-upon measurements. You may find it interesting that many of these rules were shaped by earlier customs stretching back to the Roman era. While knowledge of Roman engineering faded in some regions, echoes of older laws survived in monastic libraries and legal traditions. Monasteries often preserved mill rights granted centuries earlier, along with records describing how channels should be built or maintained. These documents served as guides for future generations, giving communities a sense of continuity even as their landscapes changed. The importance of the mill also influenced settlement patterns. Villages grew around reliable water sources, and the presence of a mill determined where paths, bridges, and markets were placed. Because of this, damage to the mill stream could disrupt far more than the grinding of grain. Flooding, erosion, or mismanagement could alter the movement of carts, change trade routes, or delay harvest processing. This is why local officials took great care to monitor the millers and enforce the regulations surrounding the waterways. Even issues such as waste disposal fell under the scope of millstream law. Dumping refuse near the channel was prohibited, as it could contaminate the water or clog the wheel. Regulations also extended to fish traps, which had to be placed in ways that did not interfere with the flow. Violating these rules could cause community-wide problems, making the stream a source of conflict instead of livelihood. In many ways, the health of the mill stream reflected the health of the community. As you follow the slow turning of the mill wheel through these dense layers of regulation, you begin to see how a single, humble structure shaped medieval law. The rules served as a bridge between personal survival and communal responsibility. They guided how people lived beside water, how they cooperated, and how they balanced competing needs. And yet, despite their detail and complexity, these laws could not account for every change in weather or every shift in the landscape. This leads to an unanswered question that villagers themselves often felt but rarely spoke aloud. If the mill stream remained the lifeline of the village, what would happen when natural forces, unexpected floods, or new technologies pushed these carefully made rules to their limits? When you return to the mill stream in this second section, you begin to notice how deeply its rhythms guided the decisions of the people who lived beside it. In the first section, you learned how rules emerged to protect the flow of water, regulate the use of mills, and prevent disputes among neighbors. Now, you will look more closely at the pressures that tested those rules. Floods, droughts, shifting landscapes, and even the gradual spread of new technologies all forced medieval communities to adapt in ways that were both practical and surprisingly restrained. Imagine early spring after a heavy winter. Snowmelt pours off the hills, swelling the narrow stream into a churning force that threatens to break its banks. Villagers walk the edges of the water, carrying wooden stakes, shovels, and bundles of brush. Their task is not dramatic but steady and essential. They must reinforce the banks, remove debris, and ensure that the mill channel does not become blocked. Each household contributes labor, and this requirement is often written into local custom. Failure to appear for such work could result in fines, because the consequences of neglect would be felt by everyone. The miller, standing at the center of this effort, watches the water levels more carefully than anyone else. Too much water could damage the wheel, or cause it to spin too quickly, wearing down the machinery. Too little, and the mill would stall. Regulations therefore required the miller to adjust the weir at specific times, sometimes several times a day. These actions were witnessed by others, not because they doubted his judgment, but because the shared resource demanded shared oversight. If the water rose higher than permitted, even by a small amount, fields and gardens downstream could flood, and when a flood arrived unexpectedly, local courts could investigate whether the miller had followed the rules or acted carelessly. Floods, however, were not the only threat. Years of steady use altered the shape of the stream itself. Silt accumulated near bends, roots from nearby trees extended into the channel, stones shifted during storms, narrowing or widening the flow. To manage these changes, communities developed a practice known in some regions as the annual Walk of the Bounds. This custom involved a group of villagers, often including elders and young apprentices, walking the entire length of the mill stream. They noted changes in the channel, pointed out potential hazards, and assigned responsibility for repairs. These walks served not only as inspections but also as lessons, teaching younger generations the details of their landscape. Such methods were a form of quiet engineering. No grand plans or written diagrams guided the work. Instead, knowledge was passed verbally from one person to another. Over time, the community built a collective memory of how the water behaved. If a certain bend in the stream always collected branches, residents knew to check it after storms. If a bank eroded during dry periods, they remembered how to reinforce it. These small acts were essential to preventing greater damage. Yet disputes still arose. A farmer might accuse the miller of drawing too much water. A neighbor might complain that a section of bank near another property was left unrepaired. Conflicts like these were usually brought before the village court, a body composed of respected local men who understood both the law and the practical needs of agriculture. The court listened to testimony, often calling on witnesses who had observed the stream or the miller's actions. Resolutions were typically straightforward. The court ordered repairs, imposed minor fines, or clarified ambiguous boundaries. The goal was not punishment but restoration of order. One interesting feature of these disputes is how rarely they escalated. Because the mill stream was so central to the entire community, people recognized that prolonged conflict would harm everyone. This created a culture where negotiation and compromise were normalized. Even lords and monastic officials who held formal authority understood the necessity of listening to local knowledge. They might grant rights or issue charters, but management of the stream still depended on the hands and eyes of those who lived closest to it. At the same time, the spread of new milling technologies began to reshape these traditional systems. In some regions, horizontal wheels were replaced by vertical ones. Different types of gears appeared, allowing mills to operate more efficiently or process different kinds of grain. These innovations required adjustments to existing regulations. A mill with a faster wheel might need more water at certain times. A stronger structure could divert the flow in ways that older mills had not. Communities had to update their agreements, sometimes rewriting parts of charters or changing the height limits of weirs. This process was often slow, not because people resisted change, but because they wished to make sure each modification did not create unexpected problems. A single adjustment could alter how quickly the water moved downstream, affecting gardens, small fish weirs, or even laundry areas. The mill stream served many uses beyond powering the wheel, and each one had to be considered. Women washed clothes along the banks, children gathered water for cooking, and livestock drank from designated sections. The stream was not simply a channel for labor, but part of daily life. You may notice how the steady presence of the mill created an unusual balance between communal obligation and personal responsibility. The miller had specialized knowledge, but relied on the community for repairs and oversight. The villagers depended on the mill but retained a voice in its operation. This interdependence shaped the rhythm of village politics. Decisions were rarely made through rigid authority. Instead, they emerged through gradual consensus, grounded in experience and necessity. Natural forces continued to disrupt this balance. Drought years posed challenges that were just as serious as floods. When the stream narrowed to a trickle, the mill could not turn. Villagers responded by deepening the channel, clearing silt, or even carrying water from nearby springs to replenish the flow. Some communities established rotational milling schedules to conserve water. Grain would be ground only on certain days or during cooler hours when evaporation was slower. These schedules were recorded in local rolls, ensuring that no household felt disadvantaged. The presence of wildlife also affected the stream. Beavers, in regions where they remained abundant, built dams that blocked the flow entirely. Removing these structures required coordinated effort, and local rules sometimes dictated when and how such work could be done. Fish migrating upstream to spawn could become trapped if the weir stood too high. Some charters required the miller to lower the boards during specific weeks, allowing fish to pass. These rules reveal how medieval life recognized the importance of maintaining ecological balance long before the concept gained formal expression. Across these many adjustments, one principle remained steady. The mill stream belonged to the community, not to any single individual. Even when a lord claimed rights, the practical work of managing the water fell to villagers who depended on it daily. Their knowledge, shaped over generations, guided the rules more effectively than any distant authority. In this way, medieval society created a legal and practical system, grounded not in theory but in observation. As you consider the delicate balance held together by rules, customs, and cooperation, a new question emerges. If the community relied so deeply on shared knowledge and mutual care, what happened when the landscape changed so dramatically that the old habits could no longer be relied upon at all? As this story reaches its conclusion, the mill stream stands not merely as a channel of water, but as a testament to the quiet ingenuity of medieval communities. In the previous sections, you explored how the stream-powered mills structured daily life and required detailed regulations to prevent disputes, floods, and shortages. You also saw how villagers and millers cooperated to manage the ever-changing landscape, relying on observation, shared experience, and incremental adaptation. Now, in this final section, you will see how these systems ultimately reached resolution, what lessons they left behind, and how they shaped both medieval and later society. Imagine a midsummer afternoon, with the mill wheel turning steadily, sunlight flickering on the flowing water. After weeks of careful maintenance and occasional minor conflicts, the community has found balance. The banks are reinforced, silt cleared, and minor repairs completed. Villagers can rely on a steady supply of flour, and the miller performs his work with precision, aware that the stream's health depends on his attention. The laws governing the mill, once abstract words on parchment or memory of oral agreements, have been tested, enforced, and adjusted. This is the moment where regulation, labor, and environment converge into a functioning system, a fragile but enduring equilibrium. In times of flood or drought, this balance could still be strained. A sudden summer storm could tear through the channel, damaging the wheel and washing away newly repaired banks. Drought could reduce the stream to a trickle, slowing the mill to a near halt. Yet, by the late medieval period, communities had developed a rhythm of response. Repair teams were ready, alternative schedules ensured fair distribution of milling services, and long-standing agreements allowed temporary deviations from normal rules. Through these adaptive strategies, the village could survive disruptions that might have once caused famine, conflict, or social unrest. One striking feature of this system was its reliance on observation rather than formal enforcement alone. Millers and villagers were expected to notice subtle changes in water flow, seasonal variations, and weather patterns. They responded with interventions that were small, incremental, and locally negotiated. The rule of the mill stream was not rigid in the sense of dictating every action, but it was strict in principle, guiding the community towards stability while leaving room for judgment and improvisation. It was a law deeply informed by ecology, labor, and mutual trust. Disputes that arose were usually resolved through local courts or assemblies, but their resolutions emphasized restoration rather than punishment. If a miller mismanaged water, he might be required to repair the damage and temporarily allow neighbors to adjust their access. If a farmer blocked a channel accidentally, fines or labor obligations ensured that the problem was corrected quickly. These solutions reflected the underlying logic of the system. The stream was a shared resource, and harm to it affected everyone. Individual rights were balanced against collective needs, a principle that gave the rules both legitimacy and resilience. The mill stream also shaped broader aspects of medieval life beyond immediate practicalities. It influenced settlement patterns, trade routes, and social hierarchies. Towns developed around reliable mills, and access to these facilities could determine economic opportunity. Millers themselves occupied a unique social niche, blending specialized knowledge with communal responsibility. Their position, while sometimes viewed with suspicion, was essential to the daily life of the village. The functioning of the stream became intertwined with survival, economy, and social order. As you consider these dynamics, you notice another layer: adaptation over time. Technological advances, such as improved gears and wheel designs, allowed mills to operate more efficiently. Changes in climate, shifts in agriculture, and the arrival of new markets forced communities to adjust rules, schedules, and responsibilities. Despite these changes, the underlying principles of fairness, cooperation, and careful observation remained constant. The mill stream teaches a subtle lesson about resilience. Systems built on shared responsibility, local knowledge, and incremental adaptation can endure far longer than rigidly imposed decrees. By the end of the medieval period, many of these traditions persisted, influencing early modern water management, legal structures, and rural economies. Engineers and planners, centuries later, often relied on principles first tested beside simple streams with wooden wheels. The logic of proportional use, oversight, and dispute resolution had its roots in the quiet governance of villages where survival depended on a turning wheel and a flowing channel. These systems demonstrated that even ordinary elements of daily life, water, wood, and grain, could become the foundation for social stability and legal innovation. And yet, as this story closes, a thought remains unresolved. The medieval rules of the mill stream were built on observation, trust, and cooperation, but they were always contingent upon natural conditions. What would happen when human ambition, environmental change, or technological disruption exceeded the capacity of those carefully balanced rules? How could a system that had endured centuries respond to pressures beyond what its creators had imagined? These questions linger quietly, reminding you that even the most orderly of medieval regulations existed within a world that was constantly shifting. When you walk the streets of a medieval town, it is easy to imagine people wearing the same rough wool tunics and simple leather shoes. Yet, in reality, clothing was highly regulated, not just by social expectation, but by law. These regulations, known as sumptuary laws, were designed to control what people could wear, what fabrics they could buy, and even the colors and decorations allowed for different social classes. At first glance, these laws may appear absurd, an unnecessary restriction on fashion, but their origins and purposes reveal a surprisingly practical side of medieval society, one shaped by economy, hierarchy, and the avoidance of social conflict. In this first section, you will explore the foundations of these regulations and why they mattered more than one might expect. Imagine a bustling market town in the late 14th century. Merchants have set up stalls overflowing with cloths of all types: coarse wool, fine linen, silk imported from Italy, and dyed velvet in deep, vibrant colors. Citizens of various classes walk the streets: peasants in muted fabrics, merchants and minor officials in richer materials, and nobles in luxurious silks and furs. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. For instance, only the wealthiest nobles might adorn themselves with ermine, while certain silks or gold-threaded fabrics were restricted to upper-class citizens. Peasants attempting to display such items could be fined or required to forfeit the garment. The rules were detailed, specifying not only material and color, but also patterns, trims, and even the width of belts and sleeves. These regulations had several intertwined purposes. First, they reinforced social hierarchies. In a world where personal status was critical to safety, economic opportunity, and marriage prospects, clear visual markers helped prevent disputes. If a peasant could disguise themselves in noble finery, misunderstandings could arise, sometimes leading to violence or accusations of fraud. By controlling appearances, authorities maintained order and ensured that social boundaries were respected. The second purpose was economic control. Fabrics such as silk or imported velvet were expensive, and overconsumption by those outside the upper classes could destabilize trade. Monarchs and city councils feared that demand from the lower classes would increase prices and deplete scarce resources. By limiting the purchase of certain textiles, authorities could maintain the flow of goods, protect local industries, and prevent social unrest caused by scarcity. In this sense, sumptuary laws were less about fashion policing and more about regulating markets, ensuring that wealthier citizens could maintain their expected levels of luxury while preventing widespread economic strain. Religious and moral considerations also shaped these laws. The medieval church emphasized modesty, humility, and the avoidance of ostentation, particularly for those of lower social standing. Wearing extravagant clothing could be seen as prideful or sinful, challenging the moral order. Sumptuary laws, then, were reinforced by spiritual reasoning. They were a legal way of encouraging conformity with accepted virtues. Town councils and royal decrees often referenced these religious motivations explicitly, warning that violations were not only a civic offense but also morally questionable. The administration of these laws was surprisingly detailed. Inspectors or local officials were tasked with patrolling markets, fairs, and streets to ensure compliance. Merchants had to label their goods according to the buyer's permitted social rank, and garments could be seized if rules were violated. Enforcement varied depending on the locality and the strength of local governance. In some towns, the penalties were strictly financial, while in others, public shaming was employed to reinforce the social lesson. You might picture a crowded market square where a person of lower rank wearing forbidden colors is made to remove the offending garment in front of neighbors, serving both as punishment and as a deterrent. Yet, while these laws may appear rigid, they also allowed for flexibility and adaptation. Exceptions were sometimes granted for festivals, weddings, or special ceremonies. Certain types of ceremonial clothing could be worn by individuals outside their normal social category if granted permission. These allowances reflected the understanding that social life required occasional bending of the rules while maintaining the underlying framework of hierarchy and order. Sumptuary laws also influenced daily life in subtle ways. Families had to plan purchases carefully, ensuring that children wore acceptable fabrics and that household servants dressed according to legal guidelines. Craftsmen and tailors adjusted their designs to comply with regulations, sometimes producing simplified versions of luxurious garments for clients who could not legally wear the full version. Even dyeing practices were affected, as certain colors were restricted to specific classes, leading to innovations in color production and the careful management of materials. Interestingly, these laws also served a defensive function. By marking social status clearly, communities could reduce disputes and prevent misunderstandings that might escalate into violence. A noble traveling through a town could immediately recognize who belonged to which social tier, and merchants could prioritize customers according to accepted rules of rank. This visual order was a kind of early social infrastructure, quietly sustaining stability in a world without modern identification systems or formal documentation for every transaction. Despite their apparent absurdity to a modern observer, sumptuary laws reveal a medieval society acutely aware of risk, hierarchy, and resource management. Clothing was not merely personal expression, it was a statement of position, a marker of economic behavior, and a tool for social regulation. The laws shaped behavior, reinforced morals, and kept communities functioning smoothly. In this sense, what may seem like a trivial restriction actually reflected centuries of observation, negotiation, and practical reasoning. And yet, as you reflect on these meticulous rules, a question arises: what happened when someone deliberately defied these laws, either out of pride, necessity, or rebellion? Could a single breach unravel the careful visual order of society, or would communities find ways to adapt and reinforce the rules despite such challenges? As you continue into the second section of the story on sumptuary laws, the focus shifts from their origins to the complex system of enforcement that ensured these laws were more than just theoretical rules. You have already seen how medieval authorities defined who could wear what, why colors, fabrics, and adornments were restricted, and how these laws served economic, social, and moral purposes. Now, you will explore the mechanisms by which these regulations were implemented, the social dynamics they created, and the subtle ways that ordinary people navigated a system that governed even the threads of their clothing. Picture a bustling market town in the late 15th century. Merchants display bolts of silk, velvet, and fine wool in the sunlight, while tailors stand ready to cut garments to order. Inspectors, often called wardrobe keepers or sumptuary officers, move through the crowd with a watchful eye. Their task is meticulous. They must ensure that each garment, belt, or accessory conforms to the buyer's permitted rank. In practice, this meant examining the quality of fabric, The intricacy of embroidery, the width of belts, and even the types of fastenings or buttons used. Every detail was codified, often in local charters or municipal ordinances, so that the rules could be applied consistently. Enforcement was both a public and communal affair. When violations occurred, the penalties varied from town to town. Some cities imposed fines payable to local authorities. Others mandated the forfeiture of the garment. In extreme cases, public humiliation was employed. The offender might be paraded through the marketplace wearing only a basic, approved outfit. These practices served not only to punish, but to educate the broader population, reinforcing the visual hierarchy that the laws were meant to protect. Public observation became a tool for social conditioning, reminding all citizens of the consequences of overstepping their bounds. Yet enforcement relied heavily on negotiation and social networks. Inspectors did not act alone. They depended on reports from neighbors, merchants, and other townspeople. Villagers had a vested interest in compliance because breaches could cause misunderstandings, resentment, or even conflict. For example, a wealthy merchant flaunting forbidden silk could provoke jealousy or anger among peers, potentially destabilizing delicate social balances. By reporting violations, ordinary citizens contributed to the maintenance of order while also protecting their own positions within the community. Interestingly, these laws also created opportunities for innovation and subtle defiance. Tailors and craftsmen developed clever ways to comply technically with the law while still producing visually impressive garments. A noble might commission a dress with legally permitted colors but intricate patterns that gave the appearance of forbidden luxury. Merchants sometimes sold layered clothing where the outer garment met legal specifications but the inner layers displayed richer textures or embroidery. These adaptations reveal the ingenuity of medieval consumers and the flexibility of the law when confronted with practical reality. Sumptuary laws also influenced household management. Families had to plan purchases carefully, often months in advance, to ensure children and servants dressed appropriately for daily life and special occasions. Wealthy households maintained records of who was allowed to wear which garments and trained servants to dress correctly. Clothing became part of a household's identity and a visible reflection of status, with failure to comply risking both social embarrassment and legal penalty. In this way, the law shaped not only public behavior but domestic routines and expectations. Religious and ceremonial events heightened the importance of compliance. Church festivals, weddings, and market fairs provided occasions where social boundaries were particularly visible. During these events, inspectors were often present to monitor adherence, and deviations could result in immediate sanctions. For example, a peasant attending a wedding in forbidden colors could be fined or forced to switch garments before the celebration proceeded. Such regulations reinforced communal awareness of hierarchy and subtly reinforced social cohesion by creating shared expectations of propriety. Economic reasoning remained a central factor. Sumptuary laws limited overconsumption of expensive fabrics and protected local artisans from competition with imported materials. They also helped regulate supply chains. Silk and velvet were not abundant commodities. Restricting access ensured that prices remained stable, and that wealthier citizens retained their privileges without threatening the economic balance of the town. These laws, while outwardly focused on morality or decorum, were in many ways sophisticated tools of fiscal management. Yet, despite rigorous enforcement, the system was never perfect. Black markets for restricted fabrics existed, and some individuals intentionally flouted the rules. Merchants sometimes bribed inspectors, or families found loopholes in regulations. When enforcement failed, authorities had to respond, sometimes with stricter oversight, fines, or public shaming. Such episodes demonstrate the continual tension between regulation and human behavior, highlighting the ongoing negotiation between law, social expectation, and personal desire. As you examine this delicate balance, you notice how sumptuary laws shaped medieval communities beyond clothing. They fostered awareness of status, influenced trade patterns, encouraged compliance through observation and social pressure, and even prompted creativity in fashion. In effect, they were an early form of social infrastructure, quietly guiding behavior and reinforcing norms without relying entirely on coercion. The laws exemplified a society in which appearances mattered profoundly, and where subtle regulations helped maintain both economic and moral order. And yet, despite these carefully crafted systems, a lingering question remains. When the rules were challenged by ambition, poverty, or simple necessity, how did communities adapt? Could the visual order imposed by sumptuary laws withstand widespread defiance, or would it slowly erode under pressure from human innovation and changing social circumstances? As this story reaches its conclusion, the intricate system of sumptuary laws stands out not merely as a set of rules about clothing, but as a reflection of medieval society's priorities, values, and the practical necessities of everyday life. In the previous sections, you explored the origins of these regulations, the rationale behind controlling fabrics, colors, and adornments, and the detailed methods of enforcement that balanced morality, economy, and social hierarchy. Now, in this final section, you will see how communities adapted to challenges, the broader impact of these laws, and the lessons they left behind. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the landscape of medieval fashion was shifting. Trade networks had expanded, bringing an unprecedented variety of fabrics and dyes from across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. These new materials tempted individuals to test the boundaries of sumptuary laws, and authorities found themselves constantly revising rules to maintain social order. Cities such as Florence, London, and Paris issued detailed decrees specifying who could wear imported silks, jeweled buttons, or gold thread embroidery, and under what circumstances. The laws became increasingly precise, listing not only fabrics and colors, but the types of collars, sleeves, and even the number of ornaments permissible. Despite these refinements, enforcement remained both practical and communal. Inspectors continued to patrol markets and fairs, while townspeople acted as informal observers, reporting violations. When breaches occurred, punishments balanced correction with deterrence, fines, seizure of garments, or temporary public humiliation. Yet authorities also recognized the need for flexibility. Festivals, weddings, and special ceremonies frequently allowed temporary exceptions, acknowledging the fluid nature of social life. This balance between rigidity and adaptation was a defining characteristic of the system, allowing it to endure even amid evolving social and economic pressures. The laws also had an unexpected impact on commerce and craft. By regulating access to certain fabrics, sumptuary laws indirectly encouraged innovation among tailors and artisans. Craftsmen developed legally compliant alternatives that mimicked the appearance of forbidden luxury materials, producing cleverly layered garments, patterned linings, or decorative trims that skirted restrictions while satisfying aesthetic desires. This fostered creativity within boundaries, shaping both fashion and technical expertise. In a sense, the laws became a driver of innovation, illustrating how regulation and ingenuity can coexist. Socially, sumptuary laws reinforced hierarchy while promoting stability. By making status visually recognizable, they reduced disputes and misunderstandings, especially in crowded urban centers where people of different ranks interacted regularly. These visual cues guided behavior, ensuring that both nobles and commoners navigated interactions with an understanding of each other's place. The laws were also educational, instilling awareness of social norms from childhood, and maintaining a framework for moral conduct, where humility and propriety were reinforced through clothing. Yet the laws were not impervious to challenge. Wealthy individuals, ambitious merchants, and even lower-ranking citizens found ways to test boundaries through bribery, creative interpretation, or outright defiance. Authorities responded with incremental adjustments, fines, and reinforcement of communal expectations. These episodes reveal a crucial truth about medieval governance. Laws functioned best when grounded in shared understanding, trust, and practical enforcement, rather than mere authority. The visual order created by sumptuary regulations depended on the vigilance and cooperation of the entire community. Over time, sumptuary laws began to wane in practical influence, particularly as social mobility increased and trade expanded further. Imported luxury goods became more widely available, and the rigid hierarchy of the medieval town became harder to enforce visually. Nevertheless, the principles underlying the laws, managing economic resources, regulating status display, and maintaining social cohesion, continued to influence early modern legal and social systems. Even in later centuries, governments would attempt similar regulations to control luxury consumption, often for economic or moral reasons, showing that the medieval approach left a long-lasting imprint. The enduring lesson of sumptuary laws lies not in their particular restrictions, but in the logic behind them. Medieval communities recognized that appearances mattered, because they conveyed information about resources, obligations, and relationships. By codifying those appearances, society could navigate complex hierarchies, reduce conflict, and maintain stability. Clothing was thus transformed from a private matter of personal taste into a communal tool for governance and social order. And yet, as this story closes, a subtle question remains for reflection. Even when regulations succeed in maintaining order, Human creativity and desire inevitably push against boundaries. What happens when these pressures grow too strong? Does society adapt, bend, or collapse under the weight of its own ambitions? In the case of sumptuary laws, we see a delicate balance, one maintained for centuries through careful observation, enforcement, and the shared commitment of entire communities, a reminder that even the most absurd-seeming rules can have deep and lasting significance. As night fell over medieval towns and villages, the warm glow of candles illuminated homes, churches, and streets. Yet few people today realize that even something as ordinary as a candle was subject to strict regulations in medieval Europe. These laws governed how candles were made, who could produce them, what materials were allowed, and even how they could be used. At first glance, such rules might seem trivial or excessive. Why police something as simple as wax and wick? The answer lies in the intersection of economy, safety, religious observance, and community survival, revealing a layer of medieval life that was both practical and surprisingly complex. In this first section, you will explore the origins and rationale of these regulations and the daily realities they shaped. Imagine a small town at dusk in the 14th century. Families gather around the hearth, preparing for evening tasks, while a priest lights candles for vespers in the local church. Each candle represents labor, resources, and legal compliance. Beeswax, the primary ingredient for high-quality candles, was expensive, and tallow, rendered animal fat, produced cheaper alternatives. Because candles were essential not only for illumination, but also for ritual and ceremonial purposes, authorities imposed rules to ensure their availability, quality, and proper use. In this way, candle regulations became a microcosm of medieval society's concern with fairness, order, and moral propriety. One of the earliest rules focused on the materials used to make candles. High-quality beeswax was often reserved for churches, monasteries, and wealthier households, while tallow was permitted for common homes. This distinction was not arbitrary. Beeswax burned cleaner, produced less smoke, and lasted longer, making it ideal for sacred spaces where purity was important. Tallow, by contrast, produced smoke, odor, and soot that could accumulate in homes, but was sufficient for daily domestic needs. Laws therefore reflected both practical and symbolic considerations, distinguishing between secular and religious use, as well as between the wealthy and ordinary citizens. The production of candles was similarly regulated. Certain towns granted guild privileges to candlemakers, giving them exclusive rights to manufacture and sell candles. These guilds enforced standards regarding size, shape, and quality. Deviations could result in fines or expulsion from the trade. Such oversight protected consumers from poorly made candles that burned unevenly or extinguished prematurely. Moreover, guild rules ensured that the delicate supply chain from procurement of wax to distribution of finished candles was managed carefully, reducing the risk of scarcity and preventing economic disputes. Beyond quality control, candle regulations also addressed fire safety, a major concern in densely populated medieval towns. Open flames were a constant threat to timber homes and thatched roofs, and improper use could spark devastating blazes. Laws often specified where candles could be placed, prohibiting them near flammable materials, in crowded workshops, or along narrow streets. In some towns, fines were imposed for leaving candles unattended overnight, and households were encouraged to extinguish lights when not actively used. While these rules might seem overly cautious today, they were critical for preserving lives, property, and communal infrastructure in a time when firefighting resources were minimal. Religious observance was another key factor in candle regulation. Candles were integral to church rituals, feast days, and processions. Authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical, monitored the distribution and use of candles to ensure proper participation in ceremonies. For example, during Lent or Advent, certain types of candles were required for specific rituals, and households might be fined for failing to observe these practices. Such oversight reinforced community cohesion and moral conformity, linking the practical use of light to spiritual life. Economic and social implications extended beyond production and use. Candles were often employed as symbols of debt, pledges, or promises. A noble might donate a candle to the church to fulfill a vow, or a town council could require households to supply a set number of tallow candles annually for communal celebrations. In this sense, candles became embedded in the networks of obligation that structured medieval society, transforming a simple commodity into a medium of social and legal exchange. Interestingly, regulations also accounted for seasonal and environmental factors. During long winter nights, demand for illumination increased sharply, while wax and tallow supplies fluctuated with bee populations and livestock harvests. Authorities sometimes imposed rationing measures to ensure equitable distribution, preventing conflicts and shortages. Town records contain accounts of households fined for consuming more than their allotted share, or for stockpiling candles for personal advantage. These measures reveal a keen understanding of scarcity management and communal responsibility. Despite their meticulous planning, enforcement was not always perfect. Black markets existed for both beeswax and tallow candles, and some households circumvented rules through private arrangements with guild members or smugglers. When violations were discovered, local courts applied fines, mandated redistribution, or publicly shamed offenders. These episodes demonstrate the interplay between legal authority, economic necessity, and human ingenuity, a recurring theme in medieval regulation. As you examine the practical, spiritual, and social dimensions of candle laws, a subtle question arises. If something as seemingly ordinary as light required such elaborate regulation, what does this tell us about the broader priorities and vulnerabilities of medieval communities? How did ordinary people navigate a world in which daily necessities were carefully monitored, and what tensions arose when individual needs conflicted with collective rules? As you move deeper into the story of medieval candle regulations, the focus shifts from the laws themselves to the lived experience of those who had to follow them. By now you understand that candles were not merely sources of light, but commodities entwined with religion, economy, and safety. In this section, you will explore how households, guilds, and communities navigated these regulations, balancing necessity, obligation, and ingenuity, while ensuring survival and social conformity. Picture a small town in the late 14th century, with narrow cobblestone streets and timber-framed houses huddled together. As night falls, smoke and the flickering glow of candles begin to fill the interiors of homes. Within each household, careful decisions are made: which candles to burn, where to place them, and how to ration them, until the next supply becomes available. Families consult local regulations, sometimes written in town rolls or posted publicly, to determine how many tallow candles each household is permitted. For wealthier homes, the use of beeswax for illumination or religious rituals is strictly monitored. Failure to comply could result in fines or social reprimand. Guilds played a central role in shaping daily life under these regulations. Candle makers, organized in powerful guilds, controlled the production and sale of both beeswax and tallow candles. They enforced standards for weight, shape, and quality, ensuring that every candle sold met legal and practical requirements. This oversight meant that households could trust the integrity of the product, but it also required adherence to rules regarding purchase quantities, permitted types, and authorized sellers. Attempts to circumvent guild control, buying candles from unlicensed makers or hoarding stock, were considered serious offenses and could trigger inspections or legal action. Daily routines were adjusted to conserve resources. Families often relied on a single candle for essential tasks and supplemented light with the fireplace when possible. In some homes, mirrors and polished metal surfaces were used to amplify candlelight, maximizing visibility while minimizing consumption. Children and servants were trained to avoid wasteful use, and households carefully stored candles to prevent damage from heat, moisture, or pests. These practices reveal a society acutely aware of scarcity and the importance of deliberate resource management. Religious observance intertwined with these practical routines. Candles were central to prayers, vespers, and feast day rituals, and improper use could be interpreted as moral neglect. Priests monitored whether parishioners supplied appropriate candles for church ceremonies, while households prepared for festivals with particular attention to lighting regulations. The interplay of spiritual obligation and practical necessity reinforced a culture of conscientious behavior, where the proper use of light was both a legal and moral duty. Communal obligations added another layer of complexity. Town councils or local authorities sometimes required households to provide candles for public events, processions, or charitable purposes. Compliance with these demands was closely monitored. Those who failed to contribute adequately could face fines, temporary loss of privileges, or social censure. In this way, candle usage became a tangible measure of participation in civic life, binding individuals to the collective rhythm of the community. Yet, human ingenuity constantly tested the boundaries of the law. Households found creative ways to stretch limited supplies, using scraps of tallow for small tasks or repurposing partially burned candles. Guilds sometimes tolerated minor adjustments when scarcity threatened production, balancing strict regulation with practical flexibility. These adaptations demonstrate how medieval communities negotiated between regulation and necessity, ensuring survival while maintaining the broader framework of social and legal order. Safety concerns also shaped behavior. Open flames were dangerous in densely packed homes, and towns were highly vulnerable to fire. Households were instructed to position candles carefully, often in holders designed to catch drips or prevent tipping. Regulations prohibited leaving candles unattended in certain areas, and local officials might inspect homes after a fire to determine whether negligence contributed to the damage. The emphasis on careful use illustrates the practical reasoning behind rules that might otherwise appear arbitrary. Economic considerations continued to influence candle practices. Scarcity of beeswax made it a high-value commodity, and markets often rationed supply to ensure that churches and wealthier homes could maintain ceremonial functions. Tallow, while more abundant, was still monitored to prevent hoarding or unfair advantage. Local authorities sometimes intervened to redistribute candles during shortages, ensuring equity and preventing social tension. In this way, candle laws functioned as an early form of resource management, blending law, economics, and moral oversight. By observing these details, you begin to see how a seemingly mundane object like a candle could structure social behavior, economic exchange, and religious practice simultaneously. Candles were not merely tools of illumination, they were instruments of control, teaching households to conserve, to comply, and to participate responsibly in communal life. The rules created a network of mutual dependence, where individual decisions about light had implications for neighbors, churches, and local authorities alike. As the section draws to a close, a pressing question emerges. With all the careful planning, rationing, and enforcement, what happened when circumstances changed? When scarcity became extreme, when fires destroyed stores, or when people deliberately flouted the rules? Could the system of candle regulation survive the pressures of human need, natural disaster, or economic disruption, or would it unravel, leaving communities in darkness both literally and metaphorically? As you arrive at the final section of the story on medieval candle regulations, the focus shifts to how communities adapted to challenges, preserved social order, and learned from the intricate rules surrounding this essential commodity. By now, you have seen that candles were not merely sources of light. They were deeply embedded in the economy, moral life, and social cohesion of medieval towns. This section explores how medieval society balanced enforcement, necessity, and adaptation, and the lessons these practices left for later generations. Picture a bustling town square on a winter evening. The streets are dark, save for the flickering candles in homes and the larger tapers lining the church interior. The town has survived the long night, thanks to careful planning. Families have rationed tallow and beeswax, guilds have maintained quality and supply, and public authorities have ensured compliance with local regulations. The careful interplay of rules, enforcement, and adaptation has maintained a fragile equilibrium, allowing life to proceed without catastrophe. In this sense, the candle became not only a source of light, but a symbol of communal order and shared responsibility. Natural and human disruptions, however, constantly tested this system. Fires, storms, or shortages of wax threatened both supply and safety. When tallow became scarce due to poor livestock yields, authorities implemented temporary rationing, redirecting materials to households and institutions that needed them most. Fires caused by unattended candles prompted revisions in safety instructions and public awareness campaigns. Even human ambition played a role. Wealthier individuals sometimes attempted to circumvent regulations, using bribery or creative loopholes to access restricted beeswax. These challenges demanded ongoing negotiation between the strict enforcement of rules and practical flexibility, showing that medieval law was rarely static but evolved in response to real-world pressures. Guilds in particular played a critical role in ensuring this adaptability. Candle makers monitored supplies, adjusted production techniques, and occasionally permitted minor deviations to prevent shortages. Their authority, backed by municipal or royal law, ensured that production remained consistent, while their knowledge of local markets allowed for pragmatic responses to scarcity. This combination of oversight and flexibility exemplifies how medieval societies balanced control with the realities of daily life, ensuring survival while maintaining social hierarchy and moral expectations. Religious and ceremonial functions continued to shape priorities. Churches relied on consistent supplies of high-quality beeswax for rituals and festivals. Townspeople understood that their obligations, whether supplying tallow candles for communal use or attending to ceremonial lighting, were integral to maintaining spiritual and social order. Candles became instruments of civic responsibility, reinforcing the interconnection between law, faith, and community survival. Even small deviations, such as using an inferior candle for a feast, could carry social or moral consequences, underscoring the importance of adherence to regulations. The economic logic behind these laws also left a lasting impact. By controlling supply, regulating quality, and restricting access, medieval authorities stabilized markets and prevented inequities that might provoke conflict. The principles behind these regulations, managing scarce resources, balancing individual and communal needs, and maintaining social order through practical enforcement, can be seen echoed in later systems of municipal control and early industrial regulation. The candle, humble though it may appear, was a medium through which complex societal priorities were enforced and negotiated. Despite the detailed laws, human creativity and adaptability remained central. Households found ways to conserve, repurpose, or stretch candle supplies, demonstrating ingenuity within constraints. Guilds adjusted production to match fluctuating demand and environmental factors. Authorities revised rules in response to unforeseen challenges, illustrating that even rigid-seeming systems relied on continual observation and adaptation. The candle law was effective, not because it could control every action, but because it worked in tandem with communal knowledge and shared responsibility. As you consider these dynamics, a broader reflection emerges. The meticulous regulation of something as ordinary as light highlights a medieval society acutely aware of vulnerability, interdependence, and the consequences of scarcity. Everyday objects, candles, in this case, became tools of governance, instruments for teaching compliance, and measures of social cohesion. Life under these regulations demanded careful planning, cooperation, and respect for communal norms. In effect, a single candle illuminates not just a room, but the logic and structure of medieval civic life. And yet, even as these systems endured, one unresolved thought lingers. When necessity, disaster, or human ambition pushed against the carefully crafted rules, could the social and moral fabric hold? Did medieval communities manage to preserve order through adaptation and vigilance, or were there moments when the laws themselves failed, leaving towns and households in literal and metaphorical darkness? These questions remain, offering a quiet reminder that even the most practical and seemingly mundane rules reflect deeper concerns about survival, order, and human behavior. As you walk through a medieval town, you may notice the stone bridge arching over a river or stream, carrying pedestrians, carts, and livestock. Today, bridges are simply infrastructure, functional, unremarkable, and taken for granted. But in medieval Europe, bridges were governed by surprisingly detailed rules that shaped daily life, commerce, and community interaction. These regulations addressed safety, social order, and economic fairness, revealing a society that carefully observed even the most ordinary aspects of its built environment. In this first section, you will explore the origins, rationale, and practical consequences of these bridge rules, uncovering a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of medieval life. Consider a typical market day in the late 14th century. Merchants are bringing goods to the town square: sacks of grain, barrels of wine, bolts of cloth, and bundles of firewood. Villagers, artisans, and travelers move along the streets, and at some point, nearly everyone must cross the local stone bridge. Although it may appear sturdy to a modern eye, medieval bridges were structurally limited. Heavy carts, overloaded pack animals, or large groups of people could strain the stone arches, especially after winter floods or spring thaws had weakened the foundations. Recognizing these risks, authorities implemented rules to prevent accidents and ensure the longevity of the bridge. One common regulation limited the number of animals or carts allowed to cross at the same time. A cart carrying sacks of grain might be required to wait for several minutes if another heavy load had just crossed, preventing excessive strain on the bridge. These rules were simple yet effective, relying on the cooperation of travelers and merchants who understood that neglect could result in damage, costly repairs, or even collapse. Local officials often stationed guards or appointed watchmen to enforce these rules during busy times, illustrating how regulation extended from law into everyday practice. Pedestrian behavior was also governed. Town charters sometimes dictated which side of the bridge people should walk on, particularly on narrow spans. Rules could specify that those carrying heavy loads give way to travelers with carts, or that animals be led in single file to prevent crowding. Failure to comply might result in fines, but the greater goal was communal safety. Bridges were points of congestion, and accidents could injure or kill individuals, block trade, and create disputes between neighbors or merchants. In a society without formal traffic control, these ordinances functioned as essential guides for orderly movement. Economic concerns intertwined with safety. Bridges were often funded by tolls, collected from merchants and travelers. These fees were carefully regulated too high, and trade would diminish too low, and funds would not cover maintenance. In some regions, exemptions were granted to local peasants transporting essential goods, reflecting a recognition of economic necessity. Toll collectors and local officials had the dual task of enforcing safe crossing and ensuring accurate payment, a combination of civil and commercial responsibility. The rules balanced financial sustainability with the practical needs of the community, highlighting the pragmatic logic behind seemingly mundane regulations. Religious and ceremonial considerations further shaped bridge use. Bridges were sometimes sites of ritual, such as blessing processions or offerings to ensure safe passage. Certain feast days could require specific arrangements, like reserving sections for clergy or community officials, and these customs were codified in local ordinances. Such regulations reinforced social hierarchy while integrating communal spaces into spiritual and civic life. A bridge, then, was not merely infrastructure. It was a regulated social space, mediating interaction between diverse members of the town. Maintenance formed another critical aspect of medieval bridge regulations. Stone and timber structures were vulnerable to flood, frost, and wear from constant traffic. Local ordinances often required nearby households or guilds to contribute labor for repairs, clear debris, and ensure safe access. Neglect could result in penalties, as the cost of collapse would affect the entire community. Annual inspections were sometimes conducted, with officials walking the span to note cracks, loose stones, or erosion. This practice demonstrates how regulation, observation, and communal labor worked together to protect essential infrastructure. Dispute resolution was an inevitable part of bridge life. Arguments could arise over toll payments, right-of-way, or damage caused by overloaded carts. Local courts adjudicated these conflicts, often relying on witness testimony or records of previous inspections. Punishments were typically practical, repairing damage, paying fines, or temporarily restricting access, rather than punitive for its own sake. The underlying principle was the protection of a shared resource and the preservation of social harmony. And yet, despite careful rules, bridges remained precarious. Natural forces such as floods, ice, and landslides could undermine even the most robust structures, and human error could provoke accidents. The combination of environmental, social, and economic pressures meant that managing a bridge required constant attention, foresight, and coordination. Communities learned that infrastructure was not just stone and mortar, but a living system dependent on careful regulation, cooperation, and vigilance. As you reflect on these rules, a question emerges. If something as simple as crossing a bridge required detailed ordinances and shared responsibility, what happened when multiple pressures, floods, overloaded carts, or reckless travelers combined unexpectedly? Could the community respond quickly enough to prevent disaster, or did some accidents reveal the limits of regulation and human compliance? In the previous section, you explored the rules governing medieval bridges, limits on load, pedestrian behavior, toll collection, maintenance, and ceremonial use. In this section, you will dive into how ordinary people interacted with these regulations, how communities enforced compliance, and how adaptation and ingenuity allowed towns to maintain safety and order, despite the unpredictable pressures of daily life. Picture a market day in a 14th century town. Farmers bring carts of grain, shepherds lead flocks of sheep, merchants carry bales of cloth, and travelers cross the bridge on foot. Each individual knows the rules, only one heavy cart at a time. Animals in single file, pedestrians on designated sides. These regulations are not just theoretical. They shape movement, timing, and even social interaction. Traders adjust schedules to avoid peak traffic, and neighbors coordinate crossings, creating an informal rhythm that minimizes accidents. Compliance is both a practical necessity and a social expectation, reinforced by communal observation. Guilds and town officials played a central role in managing compliance. Toll collectors stationed at bridge entrances observed behavior, collected fees, and occasionally instructed pedestrians and drivers to wait for the previous group to clear the span. Bridge watchmen enforced safety rules during busy periods, stepping in to redirect animals or carts. Their presence was not merely authoritarian, it provided guidance and coordination, preventing collisions and damage to the structure. Through this system, the bridge functioned as a regulated public space, where law, observation, and communal cooperation intersected seamlessly. Households and travelers developed practical strategies to navigate these rules. Farmers often timed their journeys to avoid overlapping with heavy carts or ceremonial processions. Merchants ensured their loads were properly balanced to avoid penalties or accidents. In some cases, travelers negotiated temporary exceptions, such as moving slightly faster to avoid causing delays for essential goods. These adaptations highlight the everyday ingenuity required to comply with medieval infrastructure regulations while fulfilling personal or economic obligations. Safety was always a central concern. Bridges were narrow, exposed to the elements, and prone to wear. Officials regularly inspected stonework and wooden railings, noting cracks or erosion. Citizens contributed to maintenance, clearing debris, repairing minor damage, and reporting potential hazards. Violations, such as overloading a cart or ignoring traffic rules, could result in fines or obligations to repair damage. The combination of legal oversight, communal responsibility, and personal initiative created a dynamic system capable of sustaining the structure over time. Economic considerations reinforced compliance. Bridges often generated revenue through tolls, which funded repairs and maintenance. The careful collection and regulation of tolls ensured that the bridge remained operational and that resources were allocated efficiently. Some towns allowed exemptions for local residents transporting essential goods, reflecting a balance between financial necessity and practical function. In this sense, the bridge served not only as a physical structure, but also as an instrument of economic management, linking daily life with broader civic organization. Religious and ceremonial obligations continued to influence behavior. Processions, festivals, and church events occasionally required temporary prioritization of certain travelers or spaces on the bridge. Citizens learned to adjust, waiting patiently or altering routes to accommodate special occasions. These practices reinforced hierarchy, communal participation, and social cohesion. The bridge was not just infrastructure, it was a regulated stage where social norms, civic responsibility, and economic activity converged. Yet human ingenuity and unpredictability constantly tested these rules. Travelers might attempt to circumvent tolls, push carts too heavily loaded, or cross in unsafe conditions. Officials had to balance enforcement with pragmatism, allowing minor deviations when necessary, while maintaining overall order. This constant negotiation between law, necessity, and human behavior reflects a core feature of medieval life. Regulations were effective, not because they eliminated risk, but because communities shared responsibility for adaptation, compliance, and mutual oversight. By observing the everyday practices surrounding bridges, you begin to understand how medieval communities managed risk, facilitated trade, and preserved safety without modern infrastructure, traffic signals, or formalized engineering standards. The bridge emerges as a living system, dependent on regulation, cooperation, and the practical wisdom of those who used it daily. And yet, even with these systems in place, an unresolved question lingers. When multiple pressures coincided: flooding, overloaded carts, inattentive travelers, could communities respond quickly enough to prevent accidents? Or were there moments when the limitations of law and human compliance revealed the fragility of even the most carefully maintained infrastructure? As this story reaches its conclusion, the medieval bridge stands not merely as a passage over water, but as a testament to communal coordination, legal foresight, and practical ingenuity. In the previous sections, you explored the rules that governed bridge use, the daily strategies employed by citizens, and the ways in which guilds and authorities enforced compliance. Now, in this final section, you will see how these systems resolved challenges, adapted to pressures, and left enduring lessons for medieval and later societies. Imagine a rainy spring day, with swollen rivers threatening the stability of stone arches. Merchants wait with their carts, travelers pause on the approaches, and officials inspect the structure for cracks or debris. In this moment, the rules governing load, spacing, and pedestrian flow prove their value. By staggering traffic, monitoring animal movement, and prioritizing repairs, the community prevents accidents that could devastate trade or injure residents. The bridge functions not merely as infrastructure, but as a regulated system in which law, observation, and cooperation maintain both safety and continuity. Despite careful planning, disruptions were inevitable. Floods could weaken foundations, storms could wash away temporary footings, and human error or ambition could create dangerous conditions. When accidents occurred, local authorities responded with pragmatism, assessing damage, imposing fines for negligence, and coordinating repairs. Communities learned from these events, revising ordinances, reinforcing weak points and adjusting rules to reflect environmental realities. The system demonstrated flexibility and resilience, proving that even rigid-seeming regulations depended on adaptation and shared responsibility to succeed. Economic logic remained central to bridge management. Toll revenues funded maintenance, ensured equitable access, and encouraged compliance with usage regulations. Guilds and town councils monitored both the collection of fees and the safe movement of goods, balancing financial sustainability with public safety. Temporary exemptions for essential traffic, ceremonial events, or urgent deliveries illustrate the practical adaptability embedded within the rules. In effect, the bridge served as both a physical and economic artery, linking daily life to broader civic organization. Social and religious dimensions intertwined with practical concerns. Bridges were sites of processions, ceremonial passage, and sometimes even ritual offerings for safe travel. Observance of these traditions required coordination and compliance, blending spiritual priorities with civil regulation. Citizens learned to navigate this layered system, recognizing that bridges were not merely physical structures, but communal spaces where social hierarchy, faith, and law intersected. The legacy of these regulations extends beyond medieval life. The principles underlying bridge ordinances, managing risk, coordinating collective behavior, enforcing safety, and balancing individual need with communal responsibility, inform modern infrastructure management. Lessons in shared oversight, incremental adaptation, and practical enforcement echo in contemporary traffic control, urban planning, and disaster preparedness. Medieval bridges, in their careful regulation and communal stewardship, offer an early example of how societies can sustain complex systems in the absence of modern technology. Yet, even with these sophisticated measures, a final question lingers. When nature's forces, human ambition, or sheer unpredictability converged, could medieval communities maintain equilibrium, or were there moments when these bridges, and the rules that govern them, failed, exposing vulnerabilities in both infrastructure and social coordination? The answer remains partially unresolved, reminding you that regulation and ingenuity, while powerful, exist within a world always at the mercy of change.